acknowledge the amazing Bison. I'd like Indigenous nations include Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, and Dakota Sioux. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional land of Treaty 6 territory and the traditional Métis homeland. So people and our non-human relatives, we've lived here in Amiskwaci, Wisconsin, which is a very significant name for tonight. That is the name of Edmonton, which means Beaver Hills House. Elk Island is within the Beaver Hills Bison. So I'm super excited to talk about the conservation work that the Elk Island National Park is doing. It's also known as the Central Parkland, and it's actually one of Alberta's most endangered ecoregions that many people don't know about. We're a special area, the transition area between the prairies to the south and the boreal to the north, and that makes us very special. It also makes us have high amounts of habitat conversion because they're fertile lands. We're known as the duck factory of North America. And so as a visitor on this land, I'm very grateful to be here. We can host this and learn more about efforts being done to conserve this amazing parkland species that we negatively impacted so recklessly hundreds of years ago. So now to meet our special guest, though, this is David Bruinsma. Did I get that right?
Yeah, close enough.
Close enough. It's like my last name, Shire Shear. David has been on the resource conservation team at Elk Island National Park since 2019, and he's coordinated the park's bison management program since 2022. He's very passionate about continuing Elk Island's important role in bison conservation, especially through the transfers of surplus bison from the park to other conservation projects. So in addition to the bison program, though, David spends much of the spring and summer months focused on monitoring Elk Island songbirds and species at risk, including bats and toads. And he has, which we'll have you come back for a talk on that one. He has a background in avian ecology and species at risk, having worked elsewhere in Western Canada on boreal and grassland songbird monitoring and recovery. He holds a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Studies and a Master's degree in Natural Resource Management. And he lives in Edmonton with his wife, two sons, and 2 guinea pigs. So, thank you very much, David, for spending your evening with us.
Yep,
and
thank
I'll
you.
pass it over to you.
All right, thank you. Oh, gotta lower this down again. All right, can everybody hear me if I'm this close to the mic? Is this good? This is loud enough? So thanks to Catherine for the introduction. I am here to talk to you about bison tonight, but as my little bio there indicates, my background is not actually in sort of mammal biology and bison. I did graduate work on birds, and I sort of found myself at Elk Island National Park doing more sort of biology things on the resource conservation team, and I guess sort of eventually wound up in the bison position leading the program, not because I'm an expert on bison. We have a team of people that does that, so we have veterinarians that will come in. We have other people who have expertise in genetics of bison, in bison handling. So I kind of coordinate that, and I've learned a lot since I've been there, but I'm not necessarily the expert on the species. So when there's time for questions, I will do my best, but I might need to refer you on to other folks and give you my contact information afterwards if I don't know the answer. So I'm going to talk to you today about bison conservation and management in and out of Elk Island National Park. Oh, there we go. And I'd also like to start off Indigenous peoples. So I acknowledge Indigenous peoples who have stood and who continue to have a responsibility to work towards reconnection and shared stewardship. This year's. Hour unto itself. So it's going to be a little bit of a whirlwind tour of lots of things about bison and touching on as much as I can. But each one of these things I'm kind of just So we could go in more depth with questions if you like later. But I've got a presentation just on bison handling and all the things we use to move bison in low stress ways. But I'll get into some of that, but not in too much depth. But I would like to talk to you about the history of bison in Elk Island National Park. Bison is a keystone species in the park and how they would have been prior to their near eradication from North America. A little bit of the overview of how we manage bison in the park and the bison handling techniques that we use to do some of that. That'll involve a little bit of an overview of the bison handling facility that we use in the park. And then through that facility, we also remove surplus animals from the park to transfer them to other conservation projects and Indigenous communities. I'll go on a little bit to talk about some of the future transfers that we have coming up, and then we'll have just a chance for some questions and discussion afterwards. So to begin with, as Catherine kind of alluded to as well, unfortunately, we all know that bison used to be in the tens of millions in North America. Estimates range anywhere from 20 million on the lower end up to 60 or 80 million on the higher end. It's kind of a, without scientific data and written records, it's hard to know. But it was in the tens of millions, maybe on the upper end of that towards 60 or 80 million. But in the 1880s and before, as Western America, they are responsible for most that were here. And that was partly to fuel the that kind of thing. When after they were dyed, the bones were used as fertilizer. But a lot of it was also to cattle on the land, and it was also part of whether official or unofficial methods of removing a source of sustenance and cultural importance of Indigenous people. And just to off the land, the colonizers also wanted to remove Indigenous people from most of those lands and make them dependent. I'm not going to go into that. Not my story to on that either. But where we were in sort of the late 1880s, populations left scattered across North America. Northern also been persecuted. As far as plains bison were concerned, there's a few pockets in, I think it was Kansas and Texas and Montana. Two Indigenous ranchers in Montana, Pablo, I forget his first name, but Pablo and Allard. And the Pablo Allard is one of the most important founding populations for bison across North America today. Some estimates say that around 80% of the plains bison are descended from Allard. Also is there descended from that herd as well. Allard herd could no longer because the American government decided to privatize it, sell it off to farmers. The Pablo Allard ranchers could not keep those animals where they had raised them before, and the Canadian government offered. The Pablo Allard herd was purchased by the Canadian federal government in 1907, and the plan was initially to move them to something that was going to be called Buffalo National Park, which is different from Wood Buffalo National Park. Wood Buffalo National Park is up in the northeast corner of Alberta. Buffalo National Park was a national park that briefly existed around Wainwright, what's now CFB Wainwright Military Base. But in 1907, the fences on Buffalo National Park, and so the government had to put these bison somewhere in the meantime, and Elk Island already had a fence in place. The last elk herds in the area, and they said, great, we have a place to put these bison, let's put them at Elk Island. The fences at Buffalo National Park and Wainwright are complete. That's the whole, what happened to them after the Wainwright story is the whole other side of it. I'll get into a little bit. Let's see. Well, no, let's do that now. That'll actually make more sense now. Oop. Preview. Sorry. How am I? There we go. So the animals that were brought to Elk Island temporarily did get moved to Buffalo National Park near Wainwright. But in the time, 2 or 3 years that they did in Elk Island, it became kind of a tourist draw, and they had trouble rounding them all up. And so they said, let's leave some of them Elk Island. They left about 60 in Elk Island, and they moved the rest of those plains bison to Buffalo National Park in Wainwright. They were at that Buffalo National Park for, I think, about 20 years, and then by the 1930s, their population had grown to about 8,000. The federal government decided they wanted to make it into a military base instead of a national park, and there wasn't the desire to have bison there anymore. They also didn't like the sort of public image of slaughtering 8,000 bison, and so again, they were in a sort of sticky spot where they had bison nowhere to put them, and they thought, well, Buffalo National Park in northeastern Alberta has bison, let's put them there. This was, I think, after, other than nearly killing all the bison in the first place, this was the biggest mistake that we made with bison management. It's the second biggest mistake that we made with bison management in the history of bison management in North America, because they sent plains bison into the wood bison population up there, and those plains bison in the 20 or so years that they were at Buffalo National Park had acquired domestic cattle genes from crossbreeding experiments with domestic cattle, and had also contracted brucellosis at that time. And so we sent around 8,000 of the wrong subspecies of diseased plains bison with cattle genes into Buffalo National Park. And that has just been a nightmare for those animals because they're sick and they have health problems because of the diseases. It's also been a nightmare for the indigenous people in that area who used to be able to rely on those animals, which are now diseased. It's also really been, it's made wood bison conservation very tricky because now this large, quite thriving population of wood bison is 40 to 50% plains bison, genetically speaking. And so that hybridization, as much as they're the largest population of wood bison, they're sort of partially wood bison. And so Elk Island, well, I'll come to that now. So after they realized they made this mistake, the folks who realized this was terrible for wood bison conservation found a small pocket of wood bison in the Narrowling River area of Wood Buffalo National Park that they didn't think had come in contact with the diseased plains bison. And they captured 22 of those. They were pregnant females, and they brought them to Elk Island, to a separate fenced area of the park, and put them there. It turns out that those 22 seemed to be pretty much pure wood bison, that they hadn't come in contact in an interbreeding sense with the plains bison, but they had contracted brucellosis. And brucellosis is usually transmitted as soon as a calf is born and nurses from its mother. It's transmitted from the milk into the calf. And so the pregnant females, as soon as they had their calf, they separated them, they slaughtered the moms, and they hand-reared those calves. There was only 7 calves that survived that ordeal, and so all of Elk Island's wood bison were founded by 7 hand-reared calves in the 1960s. So that's kind of where Elk Island got our bison from. The lucky thing on the plains bison side is that because that Pablo Owler herd came from animals from Oklahoma and Kansas and Texas and Montana, they're actually very genetically diverse. From still only being a founding population of the 60 or so that were left in the park, they had a very diverse genetic background. The wood bison is not so much, because they're taken from a fairly small group who may have even been related, aunts and uncles and sisters to begin with, and only 7 of the babies were the original founding population. So the park's wood bison are genetically pure wood bison, but they have very low genetic diversity just because of the small founding population. So now, coming to Elk Island Park itself, by a show of hands, who's been there before? Anybody know where it is? I know Maya's been there. Obviously, some of you folks and friends at Elk Island who go there regularly. For those of you who don't know, it's about a half-hour east of Edmonton, and the park is fenced. So for the purpose of this presentation, the important thing to know is that the north block is fenced. The north block, north of Highway 16, is fenced completely separately from the south block, south of Highway 16. And the north block is where the plains bison are, and the south block is where the wood bison are. And that's mostly just kind of a matter of the wood bison on the north side. They're from further north from the Boreal. It just happened that we had that fence in place in 1907 when the plains bison came to the north block first, and that's where the wood bison went. And the park has expanded since then towards the highway, and that's just kind of the way it's stayed ever since. And really, the park is such a small area in total that if that was flipped, it's not like the habitat is more boreal or more prairie in one half or the other because it's such a small park. So people often ask me what the difference between plains and wood bison are, and many of these things can actually be identified through genetic markers as well. That sort of the hump is sort of a more rounded hill-shaped hump, whereas in the wood bison it's more of a steep cliff-shaped hump. And the can't see it so well, but there's a dotted line here. The highest point of the hump on the plains bison is equal with or behind its front leg, whereas the highest point on the wood bison, the hump is forward of the front leg, much closer to its head. And this is, most easily seen in the adult bulls. Once you start to get into calves and some of the younger cows, those, this is kind of the ideal stereotypical look of a plains bison and a wood bison. But if you look at a wood bison yearling or a plains bison yearling, they look very, very similar and grow into some of those aspects of the species. Wood bison are also on average about 15 to 20% larger than plains bison. They tend to have a little bit of a darker coat. And the plains bison, it's called the chaps, the hair on their forelegs, and the cape, which the hair goes up under their hump, tends to be a bit more starkly differentiated from the shorter hair on their hindquarters. And the hair on their head, their bonnet, tends to be a bit more of a fluffy sort of looking thing, and their beard is a bit fuller, whereas on the wood bison, the hair often on the bonnet is a bit more of a droopy, scraggly, sort of dopey look, and they have a bit more of a scraggly, pointy beard as well. So, of the many reasons that bison are important, the one I'm going to focus on tonight is that they are considered a keystone species. And we're lucky enough in Elk Island to have lots of bison, and they can still have that keystone role in the ecosystem. In most of North America, there aren't bison, and so that keystone role is not being carried out. To some extent, domestic cattle will sort of be a surrogate for that keystone role, but not in every way. So a keystone species is one that has a disproportionately large effect on its environment relative to its abundance. So in ecology, everything's interrelated, everything affects everything, but a keystone species is one that has a greater effect, a greater sort of determining effect on things around it than you would expect based on its numbers or its biomass. So one of those ways that bison has sort of a keystone role in the ecosystem is its grazing patterns. They don't graze evenly, they don't just munch the grass down to one level height. They graze in a very patchy landscape. You can kind of see it in this photo where they'll regraze the same little area over and over and over again, so it's short as a nubbin, and then they'll leave what you'd think would be equivalent grass beside it, much longer and ungrazed. And that creates some habitat heterogeneity. That means there's different niches, different opportunities for other species that need short grass or long grass or medium grass in the environment. If you have a lot of bison poop around, and the bison feces are a huge source of nutrients in the soil. They contribute to that nutrient cycling. They're also a huge amount, provide a huge amount of habitat for insects. And those insects in turn provide food for birds, and those birds provide food for coyotes, and so on and so forth. Bison also wallow, which is something that domestic cattle don't do. And that wallowing behavior is something they'll do as a dominance display, and also just itch scratches, and if they get dust in their coat, they get mites and ticks and things like that out of the way. But the wallowing depressions they create in the ground also create some of the habitat heterogeneity. So some differences between just a grassland and having these shallow depressions where water will pool. That's especially important in the spring when you have areas that might dry up. You'll have these little ephemeral wetlands that'll stay where bison have wallowed for longer than the moisture has stayed in other places. And so things like amphibians, different plants that require wetter soils can grow on the edges of these walls. Another way that bison are not equivalent to cattle in their keystone role is that when you have a big shaggy furry animal like bison, they shed a lot of hair. Bison have a lot more hair per square inch of body than cattle do, and their hair when they shed in the spring comes off in sort of felted sheets. And if you go to Elk Island in the spring, you can usually walk around and find this sort of fluffy, light brown bison wool everywhere. That wool can be used much more effectively for birds lining the nests or rodents lining the nests than cattle are, and it kind of clumps together in this very sort of useful way for picking fruit chocolate. It's also, I think, the second most insulative natural material after muskox wool. So it keeps things very, very, very warm. If you see bison in the winter, they'll have snow on their so contained on their fur that it doesn't even know the snow that's fallen. Another thing that bison contribute to the landscape is when they die, their carcasses provide a lot of meat for whoever's gathering stuff. That's a picture of a radio or a GPS-colored bear that our trail camera captured eating a bison carcass. Now, animals in Elk Island, as wildlife anywhere do, they will die of, not brucellosis or tuberculosis, but other diseases. As they get old, they age, they die, and I've been absolutely astonished when we put cameras on bison carcasses. That's something that maybe will last maybe a week and a half. And the only way you know that you're in the right place for when the carcass is the camera's still there. Like I come back and I've looked at the rib, and even the skull has been shrugged 200 meters away back out. So there's just nothing left in a short span, so we can have for treatments. Coyotes at night. Remember, there's one carcass where the camera eventually split up the deep cut killed bodies because there's so many motion triggers, all the scavengers on it. Anyway, it's just covered by ravens during the day, and then at night there's 4 or 5 coyotes that just it's gone. The insects in there as well, it's quite incredible. The carcass will just sort of like be with maggots and bugs and things like that. So it's productive carcass. So we do have lots of bison in Ohio, and we do have the keystone species role that they have had in the park since we've had them, which is great that we continue to have benefits. The problem is that Elk Island is fenced. We have to fence the bison partly for their own safety because we don't want them getting struck by vehicles. We don't want them catching diseases from livestock in the private land surrounding the park. But also because of the current reality of where Elk Island is, surrounded by mostly private land, it's just unacceptable to have bison wandering around the park, going into somebody's acreage, trampling someone's hay, eating their crops. And if they get hit on the highway, that's not great for bison. It's also going to likely be fatal for any human driver that hits a bison that turn and catch up on the property. So we do need to fence them in the park. The problem with that is that we don't have a lot of predators, essentially none that are capable of taking any bison down other than maybe the small calf. So coyotes, if there's a sick calf separated from her, able to kill a calf bison, but anything older than that isn't really subject to mutation. And they can grow anywhere from around 15 to 25% per year, around average of around 18% per year. So if we didn't do anything to remove bison from the park, it would be up to our ear bison. We also have moose and deer and elk that we have to manage for in the park. The fence is essentially bison-proof. Moose can kind of get over it. So I don't know who took these pictures, but they got a picture of a moose very awkwardly straddling over the fence. They usually pull a bunch of the staples out and take half the fence down with them. Elk can jump the fence in some places, and the deer can get under and over in other places just because they're a lot more smaller as well. Other animals that are smaller than the deer, the fence is no barrier. They can go under it, they can fly over it, they can climb through it. The fence is pretty permeable to most things bigger than a deer. With that, 12 to 25, average 18% growth rate, we have a lot of bison that are eating a lot of grass. The park is fairly small, and of the relatively small park, even less of it is foraging habitat for bison. They very much prefer to be in the grassland. You can kind of see on the map here, the yellow areas there is our grassland, land cover, and that kind of lavender color is the wetlands, which is a lot of the sedge meadows and sort of wetland edges. In the summer, they really spend most of their time in the upland grasslands. When those wetlands are frozen, they spend a lot of their time eating the sedge. Partly because they eat a lot of grass in the summer, and partly because the sedge holds its protein content better in the winter than the grass does in the winter, so it's more nutritionally useful for them being on that sedge in the winter. Also, when the ground is frozen, they can go eat stuff in the mud, so it's easy to get at. The map on your right is a sort of heat map of where some of our GPS colored bison have spent their time. You can see that those dark green areas line up almost perfectly with the yellow and lavender areas on the other map. And those colored animals were adult female bison who generally spend their time with the larger herds. So it'll be adult females with all the other females and the younger males 4 years and younger. A lot of the bulls, once they're about 5, 6 years old, they start leaving those cow-calf herds and wandering elsewhere in the park. But the bulk of the bison numbers spend their time together in these cow-calf herds, and they're really spending most of their time in these grassland areas. In order to sort of get the information on how much the population has grown from year to year, we fly an aerial survey which counts the population. We charter a helicopter, and we get to go up once a year and fly transects back and forth across the park, where we do a full census of the animals. When we get to some of these larger herds, we'll take photographs and then use the photographs to count them afterwards, because it's too hard to do that when you're moving around in a helicopter. I tried before this presentation to count the number of bison in the photo. It's over 80. I kind of lost track after a while, but there's that group alone there's I think 80 to 90 just in that one. And then based on the population count from 1 year, we'll compare the previous years and see how much it's grown and how much we need to remove in order to prevent overpopulation. So we remove wood bison and plains bison biennially in alternating years. Basically, every second year we remove plains bison, and every second year we remove wood bison from the other year. So winter we remove plains bison, next year wood bison, then plains bison, wood bison, and so on and so forth. So this winter coming up, we're going to be doing plains bison, last winter wood bison, and so on and so forth. The individuals, numbers, and the individuals we remove are designed to mimic predation and minimize the loss of diversity from the population and create a natural demographic structure. And that basically leaves us with removing disproportionately more young and more old. If you think about what wolves would be doing, if we had a wolf pack that was big enough to be depredating bison in the park, they would be killing the older, weaker, sicker ones and the littler ones that are easy to catch and kill. That also happens to line up very nicely with the best genetic diversity. Dr. Greg Wilson, who works for Parks Canada at the National Office, did his PhD on bison genetics in the park, and he's run some modeling looking at sort of 200 and 500 year scenarios of how to maintain genetic diversity. And one of his recommendations is that we should remove more than 30% of any one or two subspecies in order to retain that genetic diversity. So why do we need to handle bison to be able to remove them? If we take them out of the park, they may not be classified as wildlife where they're going, and they definitely aren't classified as wildlife going off the truck on the way where they're going. And so at the very least, we need to put an ear tag in their ear before they can leave the park. And while we're doing that, it also gives us an opportunity to collect data, to weigh and age them, to check them for pregnancy, to collect samples for research, to perform disease testing, surveillance, to make sure we still don't have some of those bison diseases of concern. We do put GPS collars on a few of them that we release back to the park to produce some of those maps like I showed you earlier. And it also gives us an opportunity to sort them into their precise load groups, so that once we've handled them and tagged them, we can put them in a group in a pen of all the same animals that are in the same destination, so that when we put them on the truck, we don't have to do any more splitting and sorting. They're in a group in that pen, and that whole pen can go on a compartment on the truck. Some of the differences between handling bison and domestic livestock, or sorry, domestic cattle, is that bison are wild animals. Cattle have had 10,000 years of selective breeding, partly for things like meat production, milk production, but also docility towards humans. Bison do not have any of that. Some privately owned and ranch bison will kind of be used to their rancher and they become tame to an extent, but they still don't have that thousands of So we're handling next year, or 2 years later, of that subspecies. The individuals are working with other two individuals who have been, yes, fenced, but otherwise wild, fending for themselves for their whole life. That's especially true for the wood bison. There's no visitor-accessible roads to drive on the south block of the wood bison area. There's just one hiking trail. And so the wood bison are even less familiar with the presence of people than our plains bison, who see more vehicles and more hikers and that kind of thing. So they're especially sort of shy and afraid of people. I'll go over quickly the bison handling facility that we use in order to do this. We try to do it in as low a stress a way as possible because they are wild animals. The map on the right is kind of an overview showing the biggest pen up to the north there, and then this large map on the inside of that showing the kind of smaller pens where we do a lot of the actual hands-on work with animals. Do all of that. We do it in the winter. It takes us about 6 days. The reason we do it is that we can bake the pens fairly. It's much more attractive to them to be eating hay than to have to dig through the snow to eat grass that's cured off and doesn't have a lot of nutrients left in it. And it's much more attractive to them to drink liquid water out of a water bowl than it is to have to melt the snow that they're eating with the grass. It's just less energetically costly to drink it when it's liquid. So when we open up the pen, we put hay out and put water, open the water bowls up. They come in pretty good numbers. Every year I'm always scared that we're going to, we need to remove 200 animals from the farm, they don't come in. And it's like 3 days after we put the hay out, it's 130 facility, and it's just a matter of sorting from there. I should mention we try to do the sorting as passively as possible, where we'll just like open a gate into an adjacent pen, put hay over there, wait for them to self-sort, come back the next day and close the pen, and then we've got this good. And we try to do that over and over again as much as possible until we have pens that are broken down by demographic class. So you have a pen of cows, a pen of female yearlings, a pen of adult cows, a pen of young bulls, a pen of old bulls, etc. And that way we're just a lot more, it's easier to handle than when you process them if we're working on the same demographic class all at once. Do all the cows at once, all the yearlings at once. At some point we do need to get on the ground with people on feet or using the tractor just to sort of split them into the groups up towards the end if that self-splits passively the way that we want, but we try to minimize that as much as possible. On the days that we're actually going to tag and process the building, we use kind of this most inner part of the handling facility. It starts with the what we call the daily handling area that has a holding pen and a splitting pen. We'll bring in a group from one of the larger pens of about a dozen bison and put them in this holding pen. And then we have handlers who are very good at knowing bison behavior, who go in on foot, and we'll pressure that group towards the bottom fenced area of there. And then back off the pressure as they start running and allow one to squirt by them, and then hold the rest back against that fence and allow one of them to continue out through the gate into the splitting pen, where there's a gate operator that closes the gate behind them. Sometimes 2 or 3 or 4 get through at once. That's fine because we can split them down the line. After that, we try to get as few as possible because we need to work with one at a time and bring that speeds for actually tagging them. The next section of the facility is the back alley. This is basically just an opportunity for us to split them down into singles if we didn't get a split of one animal. There's a bunch of gates along the way. If it's a split of one that's coming to the daily handling, we just open those gates and let it truck its way through. If we need to split up a group in between, then we can close those gates and use that further to the next area we call the single chutes area. It's finally going into that building there. We used to load up these single chute stalls. I guess I should say there's stalls that are about 1 bison width wide, 1 bison width long. We have about 12 of those stalls, and we used to put all of them in a line, so we just have one ready to process and tag. Sort of more, I guess, sort of unpacked, a little bit more, I guess, efficiently from the productivity. But it turned out to be very bad for the bison because standing really so often sort of bulk or stall and getting going again is very hard. And we've basically stopped using the back 2/3 or 3/4 of that single chutes lane. We'll just have one waiting in the last stop of the building so it's ready when you're to the side, but we don't have a whole waiting behind that. It's just too stressful. Finally, the last section of the facility is the squeeze. This is a big hydraulic machine that physically immobilizes the bison. So actually, when we bring it in there, the operator uses levers that will just close in tightly around it and hold it so that it's held tight enough that it can't move, but not so tight that it's being hurt. We have a crash gate with shock absorption. It used to be that, especially if we weren't doing as good of a job of handling them in a low stress way, if they come in too hot and hit that crash gate, especially calves with weaker necks can injure their heads or injure their necks. So we've got a crash gate with some shock absorption in that first, so it's got some give if they do come in a little bit fast. And then neck extender comes forward. There's a photo here. The neck extender comes forward behind their horns and holds their head so that they have a little bit up and down motion, but they have no more side to side motion behind their head. And that way we can actually come up close, put a blindfold on them, again, to help reduce some of that stress, and then work on tagging them and collecting other samples that we need. When they're in that squeeze, instead we can get right up close and work with them, take samples. We have an aging guide, so based on their teeth and their dental wear, we can look and get a more precise age estimate on the ones that have been wounded. And then when they're finally sorted into their groups for the transfer destinations, from this point it's much more like a cattle operation where there's a loading chute that a truck backs up to, whether it's a cattle liner or a smaller stock trailer, depending on the number that are leaving, and then we would load the animals from a pan through that loading chute. Transfers that we do, we try to prioritize transfers to other parks and bison conservation projects and to indigenous communities. We have a small proportion of these shells. I put less than 20% of the surplus, but in recent years, it's probably more less than 10% of the surplus goes for legal testing. And that's just so that we can have that same sort of confidence that we're still free of brucellosis and tuberculosis. We can test brucellosis through blood that's collected from live animals, but there isn't really great reliable tuberculosis testing medicine. We can do it with an injectable sprinkler test, but there's a lot of risk of false negatives and false positives that ends up having animals retested, and if the result is unclear, they're going to have to be killed. And a better way for us to do it is just to pick a small number of some of the oldest animals that are most likely to be sick if the diseases were present, and send them to an abattoir, and then they get their lymph nodes and lung tissue inspected and still killed. So we do that just so that we know that we're not contributing to disease issues with bison populations elsewhere that we're transferring to. We have done a lot of transfers to zoos and universities, and that was much more so in the past. And then if we still have animals that we need to remove from the park, but we don't have enough transfers, then we'll sell them to private practitioners who randomly buy them from us. We do a virtual auction where we post pictures of the animals. An auction house that we work with, and they post the numbers and weights and sizes, and people can bid and come. And that's our lowest priority. Surplus removed, and that's just the way we've done it. And I'd say fewer and fewer of the animals that we remove are removed from auction sales, and the ones that we do sell tend to be the ones that are least desired by conservation projects and indigenous communities. So I'll often have comments from the ranchers that they like, why are you selling all these old blind cows? Like, I want some good breeding stock. And we're like, yeah, but we transferred those to the conservation projects, and we're just selling these ones because we that's what we had left. In total, Elk Island has transferred over 3,500 bison to 115 different locations. It's about 2,250 plains bison and 1,250 wood bison. And this map, I need to get a new version of this map made because the provincial boundaries are not dark enough to see very well. But this is a map of the different locations that we've transferred to around Western Canada and also to Russia and to Alaska. This big yellow dot here, the dots are kind of proportional to the number of bison that we transferred. That's that transfer of bison to Buffalo National Park back in the early 1900s. So this map is going back all the way to that time period. And then there's a short animation here also basically showing that map and kind of the transfers from Elk Island elsewhere and the animals that have been transferred from those subsequent places elsewhere as well. So it kind of just gives a sense of that network. See the timeline going on the bottom there. So some of the places that you would have heard of that we've transferred bison to are the Grasslands National Park. So that's Plains bison on the left side here in Grasslands that came from Elk Island. They got bison from us in, it was 2006 or 2008. And they now have close to 500. We also transferred bison in 2018, I think it was, or 17. That picture on the right is bison that were trucked the way, but had to be heli lifted into the backcountry. They had specific shipping containers. They heli lifted to the backcountry, and then they did what's called a soft release there, where they kept them in a pen in the backcountry for a year until they had calved out for a spring and kind of bonded to that place, and then let them open the gates and let them actually. And that prevents a lot of the issues of animals that are familiar with the area wandering away into somewhere where there would be conflicts. Where this was a way to get them to bond to the area with the actual good space. We also have transferred Alaska got wood bison in 2008, and they kept them in a breeding facility near Fairbanks for 7 years. 2015, they transferred a bunch from that breeding facility into the remote backcountry of the lower Yukon River Valley. That population has done quite well in years when the weather is favorable, but just basically where they are in Alaska with really deep snowfall, ice crusting, and hard winters, a bit of a tough go. And so in the last 2 years, we transferred, or the last 2 wood bison handling years, we transferred more wood bison to Alaska in 2022, and again just this spring. And those ones, they are sending to an area of Alaska that's more inland, that has a lot drier conditions and shallower snow, and they're hoping to don't have some of those winter survival issues that they found in western Alaska. This is a picture I took in April. We got to be a follow vehicle for the truck hauling into Alaska. We didn't have permission to get to Alaska, so we drove 27 hours straight to the border, following the truck, swapping off drivers and sleeping in the car, and then sort of shook hands with the Alaskans at the border and took a slower trip back. And then, of course, Elk Island has also been very heavily involved in transfers to indigenous communities of bison. So 25% of the bison that we've transferred out of the park have gone to indigenous folks, about 30 different communities, and the number of transfers to indigenous communities has really increased in the last 5-6 years. It used to be a lot more sales, transfers to universities, transfers to zoos, and we've really kind of realized that, going back to the beginning of my presentation, where these people had their way of life stolen from them, this is one small thing that Parks Canada and Elk Island can do to sort of work towards some of the reconciliation. And it's kind of a no-brainer where we have too many bison in the park and they don't have enough bison, and it's a pretty easy equation to solve. And so we really work towards doing many of those transfers. This is a photo of Chief and Council with some of myself and some of our staff with Samson Mission a few years ago. And there's a short video from, I think it was 2018, with Onion Lake First Nation and the release of the bison out of the truck. And just all the community members who were there, super excited to see it happen. So everybody turned out and had their phones out and were super excited to see those animals come back. And then maybe one last one to mention is the transfer of plains bison that Elk Island did with the Blackfeet Confederacy and the Blood Tribe in Montana, which was a especially neat one because Elk Island's plains bison came over 100 years ago. And in 2021, or sorry, no, it was 2016, we transferred 87 plains bison back to the Blackfeet Confederacy in Montana to within a few miles of where that Pavel Allard herd had come from originally. So it really was not just a homecoming in general sense, but literally it was the great-great-great-grandchildren of the bison that had come from there that got. So that was a pretty cool story to be part of, and I don't want to be too self-congratulatory and pat ourselves on the back too much, because the federal government and Parks Canada has definitely made our share of mistakes with bison management in the past, but we're kind of make things right to the extent that we can. For future transfers, we're planning to transfer more to Alaska again in 2026 and 2028. There's potential of transfers to some of the areas of northern Alberta outside of the Buffalo National Park, working with the province on some wood bison transfers there. Not sure exactly the timeline on that. And then we're looking at transfers to Indigenous communities of plains and wood bison in the upcoming years, which as many as, I think, 7 First Nations have asked for bison this year, so we're going to try to make as many of those work as we can. And down the road, we're also looking at options for augmenting the wood bison genetically with wood bison genetics from elsewhere. It's just a matter of, it's not as simple as just bringing in animals with the breeding stock, because most of the animals are either not pure wood bison, or they are pure wood bison, but they came from Elk Island originally, so they're just a subset of our genetics, and it doesn't do any good to bring those animals back in, or diseases can hitchhike with them as well. And so it's kind of a matter of, can we get that genetic material, bringing in sperm and eggs from other wood bison populations without brucellosis and TB hitching a ride, and we want to select the animals, or we do want to select the animals that just come from very carefully, because they may have hybridized with plains bison in the past, and that might be something else we need to weigh in terms of the genetic benefits versus subspecies specific content. That is, I think, all that I have to present tonight, but there's, I think, some time left over for questions and discussion, and I'll do my best as an avian ecologist. In the orange t-shirt.
So, like, what are what are you going to do about it? How do you know that
How do we know that they're met, or how are we going to remedy the fact that they're?
How do you know?
Yeah, so with the we do it. We collect part of the samples we collect in the handle is we'll pull tail hair samples, and we don't do it every year, but every so often, Greg Wilson will redo those genetic tests to look at how much genetic diversity we've lost, and so short of bringing in animals material, we're not going to gain any new genetics, but we can look at our rate of loss in genetic drift. And for the plains bison side, we're probably one of the best genetics for plains bison still in the world. And so there's a minimum viable population size we have to maintain, but it's actually lower than what we have. We're above our genetic MVP right now, even with the limited amount of grass we have. With the wood bison side, it's a bit of a different story because they had such a small founding population. We're always kind of trying to find that balance between we can't have too many that they overgraze the park and starve, but we can't have too few, or we're going to start having inbreeding and loss. And so we're more concerned on the wood bison side. It's relatively stable-ish, but we would like to try to bring in more wood bison if we can. It's just a technical matter of how to do that properly. Yeah.
Your comments on the buffalo wallows was cool, and I'm just wondering, do they tend to stay the same from year to year? Like, once a wallow is established, does it remain? Do they keep using it, or do they tend to like abandon and create more?
I think it's both. I think it'll depend a little bit on moisture. Like they don't want to be wallow in a mud hole, so if it's been a wet year, they'll probably I'm going to start a new wallow higher and higher ground where it's drier. But they did find when they reintroduced the bison in Elk Island into Banff and followed them around, and they actually did a lot of horseback work with the initial release of those animals. They found that they actually started reusing create wallows in areas where there hadn't been wallows before they could live. And there's, the way the vegetation was and the way some of the seem to reuse walls that hadn't been used by bison in over 100 years since the bison last been mapped. So there was something either about that spot or whatever the conditions were that was the wall.
All of the locations that bison have gone back to, were they all originally there? I'm particularly thinking about the Alaska one where they were having a hard time reestablishing for bison there.
Yeah, so Alaska is, and it's, again, I shouldn't speak on behalf of the Alaskans too much, but they decided to put bison there partly because of it being very remote, and so there wasn't a lot of conflict with other livestock and wildlife management stuff, but also there was indigenous oral histories and oral traditions that had knowledge of bison having been there in the past, and some archaeological evidence of bison there as well. And so I guess that's why they chose that Yukon and Oka River Valley area first. And in the good years, in the mild winter years, they had similar population growth rates to Elk Island. And it's in those years when they have deep snow and snow crusting and things like that, that you have animals that are food deprived, starting to starve from those ones and not subject to predation, and so they had higher winter mortality in those rough winters. But we're hopeful that in the, I think it's the Beecher Flats area, which is a lot closer to Fairbanks, is the new release site. We're hoping that the winter spot.
Any other questions? Last chance?
I felt like every section of this I could have done, like Wes Olson, who's a bison expert, gives, he can do an hour talking just on the keystone species aspect of bison, and I'm trying to pack handling keystone species and all this stuff in there, but yeah, the bison and grasslands are fenced as well. So I think it's the west block of Grassland National Park has a bison paddock. And their, I think their bison paddock, their fenced area is a little larger than Elk Island even. But for them, they have similar numbers of plains bison as Elk Island in a similar size space, but they're almost all grass. Forage for bison grasslands, and there are which is largely forest and wetland.
So the locations you're going to, are they open or we're all looking at fenced or what's the?
Open in terms of open habitat type or open in terms of unfenced?
Well, not, I mean, are they all fenced or are they open that they might wander further or?
It's a little of both. So in Banff, they have natural geography to try to contain them in a backcountry valley. But where that valley exits the park, they have some drift fencing that they created to try and be permeable to other wildlife, but a pain in the butt for bison to get through. And they also monitor them with GPS collars. So a certain number have collars on them, and they assume that those collared animals are spending time with the herds. And if those collars get too close to the area they don't want them in, they'll go and take them back. Because they are essentially not welcome in some of the private lands that's out of there where is there. A lot of the indigenous archaeological we've done have been the fenced herds, so fence built before we transferred bison there. But the exception to that is the Blackfeet Confederacy that I talked about in Montana. They're currently still fenced, but there's a lot of talks going on with Waterton National Park and Glacier National Park and the wider Blackfeet Confederacy Reserve lands, where they're hoping to, in the next, maybe in the next few years, unfence the bison have shared the OED National and between southern Alberta and Montana there. And then again, Alaska is unfenced, so it really depends mostly on what the land management around is. If it's largely private land, they tend to be fenced. If it's more public land or compound, then
Why didn't they let you into Alaska? Did you do something wrong?
I don't know. It was very hard to get international travel approval. If I wasn't driving a Parts Canada vehicle, I would have just used vacation time and keep going, but I couldn't take the work truck. Any other questions?
That was a great one. Thank you, Dave. So people didn't need to hang around
Thank you. That's just
I know.
amazing. The seeing those bison race out, pretty cool. So, and thank you to the Friends of Elk Island Society as well. For a coloring book. And with that, are you sure everybody's got their name here, right? Okay, I'm gonna have somebody draw it. I told David he could put his name in it, so
I
it's
didn't.
not drawn.
I didn't.
You didn't? Oh, okay, well, then